Imagine you and your wife. You get all dressed up, looking as good as only you all know how to look. To take pictures with your coworkers and their spouse for the company that you all work for, to celebrate this huge success of the company. And the picture is posted in the local newspaper. Everybody's name is mentioned. All of your coworkers and their wives, and your name, and your wife's name is not even mentioned. Can you imagine that? But hey, it gets even worse. Hey everybody, I'm Steve Collins, and welcome to another Capaya County, Hazelhurst, Mississippi Black History Moment. Who remembers the auto sales company in Hazelhurst back in the 1940s? The company was a local Dodge and Plymouth car dealership. Now, I don't know the rightful owner of this dealership. I think it was a W.L. Douglas, maybe. I don't really know. But a Mr. C.T. Douglas was the manager, and a Mr. George Smith was assistant sales manager. The company was located on Highway 51. The exact address, I don't really know. But what I personally do know and remember, back in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, I believe it was 1986, I bought a 1949 Dodge Plymouth Special Deluxe 4-door sedan, flathead 6. I bought it from a guy out of Jackson, drove it home. The car drove really great to be as old as it was. It was 37 years old at the time. They called it a flathead 6 because of the motor, or should I say the motor block, because it was made flat with 6 spark plugs, 3 spark plugs on each side. And you could actually see the ground on each side of the motor when you raise the hood up. In fact, you could stand up under the hood beside the motor because that's how much room was on each side of the motor. I mean, there was nothing on that block like an air conditioner, like you see in cars today, all this other stuff. When you raise the hood on cars today, you can't even see the ground. But on this flathead 6, this Plymouth, this Dodge flathead 6, you could actually see the ground and you can actually stand on each side of that motor. One of the many features that I loved about this car is how quiet that it ran. I mean, when you crank the car up, you could not hear the car running. You could not hear this car running. You could touch the body of the car. You could lay your hands on this car while the car was running, and you could not feel the vibration coming from the motor. I mean, this car was really quiet. In fact, the only way that you knew that this car was running, you had to raise the hood up and see the fan and the fan belt rotating around. I mean, this car was really smooth, really quiet. Another feature that I loved about this 49 Plymouth was the seats, the front and the back seat. They were the long seat. There was nothing in between, the driver and the passenger. There was, they wasn't bucket seats like, in cars today with something in between, They was the long seat. And, and when you took your girlfriend or your wife out on a Sunday drive, she could sit right up under you. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I loved about this car. In fact, when I got married, we left the church ground in my 49 Plymouth. I mean, I'm telling you, this car was as smooth as a baby's behind. But now, let's get back to the story. Now, prior to August of 1941, in which this picture was taken, August of 1941, 3 months before this picture was taken, the auto sales company sales were off the charts. I mean, boom, off the charts. They sold a lot of cars. In fact, the local newspaper, this is what the local newspaper said about the auto sales company. The local newspaper said the auto sales company has done a business equal to that of older car dealerships in cities much larger than Hazelhurst. They sold a lot of cars. And the reason why they sold a lot of cars and trucks and what have you is because the Chrysler Corporation was working for the United States government. They were building army trucks, tanks, scout cars, and even ambulances. Yeah, ambulances for the defense of this country. In fact, the local paper even states that on June 22nd of 1941, W.L. Douglas of Dentville and Mr. George Smith, assistant sales manager of Auto Sales Company, boarded a transcontinental plane to Detroit, Michigan, where they will inspect the great defense machinery of the Chrysler Corporation. The article goes on to say that the army trucks, tanks, scout cars, and ambulance, which the Chrysler Corporation is building for the government, are all now in mass production. The article even goes on to say that the trip to Detroit was awarded to the manager and assistant manager of the Auto Sales Company of Hazelhurst for outstanding record of sales during the month of April, which was the first month under the management of Mr. C.T. Douglas. Okay, so they sold a lot of vehicles, right? Cars and trucks and what have you. But what that has to do with a Copiah County, Hazelhurst, Mississippi Black History moment? I'm glad you asked. Let's go back to the picture. According to the August 28, 1941 Copiah County News newspaper article, it said, celebrating the wonderful success of the Auto Sales Company of Hazelhurst were the personnel of the company, with their wives and friends, who left immediately after this picture was taken for a victory banquet in the Blue Room of a popular Jackson cafe. And it goes on to name all the people in the picture. Now this is where it gets very interesting, but in my opinion, very disrespectful. Mrs. C.T. Douglas, Miss Montiette Peavy, Mrs. L.L. Entrican, Mrs. Jewel Roberts, Mrs. John Kendricks, Mrs. Bill Interbetic, Mrs. Ted Groves, Mrs. George Smith, Mrs. Pete Taylor, Mrs. Roy Sanders, along with Mr. Roy Sanders, George Smith, C.T. Douglas, Michael Razzie, L.L. Entrican, Jewel Roberts, John Kendricks, Miss Dorothy Whittington, Virgil Shield, Bill Interbetty, Ted Groves, and Pete Taylor. The article ends with, the colored employees of this organization are shown on the end, period. The newspaper, the Copiah County News newspaper, didn't even bother to mention the black employees' name, let alone their spouse. Remember that they had their wives with them. And one black couple even had their son with them. But their names were not mentioned. Totally disrespectful. And what about the victory banquet that was held in the Blue Room of a popular Jackson cafe? Remember, the local paper stated that the personnel of the company, along with their wives and friends, left immediately after this picture was taken. I guess they wasn't invited to that either, being that it was 1941. In much of America, in the 1940s, racial segregation was strictly enforced, both by Jim Crow laws and by age-old customs. The civil rights movement was still in its infancy. Laws ensuring voting rights and equal access to jobs and public facilities were decades away. But unlike the Auto Sales Company of the 1940s, back in April of 1938, the Alfred and Miller Company, what we used to say, but the Alfred and Miller Company, located on Gallatin Street in Hazelhurst, did an extensive improvement and remodeling to the store in celebration of its 40 years of business growth in the country. And upon doing so, the company recognized 3 valued colored employees of the company. Porter Wynn, who some of us may remember being on the WMDC radio station on Sunday mornings back in the 1970s as the Reverend Porter N. Wynn. Next to Porter Wynn is Willie Young, and next to Willie Young is Morris Sanders. All valued employees of Alfred and Miller. And to the colored employees of the auto sales company of 1941, whose name were not mentioned, we salute you. We salute you and other men and women, black, white, or whatever color, who have stood in your shoes. We thank you for a job well done and for going beyond the call of duty. I'm Steve Collins, and thank you for watching another Copiah County, Hazelhurst, Mississippi, Black History Month.